Imagine opening your eyes to the scent of wood smoke and the choking dampness of a straw mattress beneath you. There's no soft pillow, no central heating, no glass in the windows, just wooden shutters letting in a frigid draft that cuts straight through your thin woolen blanket. You've just woken up in a thatch roof medieval cottage, and already, your day has begun in discomfort. The air is thick with the odor of old stew, unwashed bodies, and smoke from the fire that burned low through the night. You're sleeping in the main room, of course, because there's likely only one room for the entire family. If you're lucky, you're sharing your straw pallet with siblings. If you're not, you might be pressed up against livestock, brought indoors to prevent theft or freezing. There's no running water, so the morning ritual doesn't include brushing your teeth or a hot shower. Instead, you're handed a bowl of cold water, possibly used by someone else before you end a rag. Soap, maybe, if the household is fortunate, but it likely smells like lard and lye. And your breath. It's going to be awful, because toothpaste doesn't exist and most peasants lose their teeth by early adulthood anyway. The light that filters in through the window isn't warm or golden, it's pale and grey, and the chill of the morning air seeps into your bones. Outside, a mud path stretches through the village. It's not paved, just packed dirt, churned up by hooves and boots and carts. In winter, it turns to slop. In summer, it bakes into cracked dust. Your feet go into worn leather shoes with holes in the soles. Your tunic is made from coarse, itchy wool, and your underclothes, if you have any, haven't been washed in weeks. As you rise and prepare to face the day, your stomach rumbles, but there's no bacon, no coffee, no eggs. If you're lucky, there might be some stale bread and onion broth left over from yesterday. If not, you'll be working on an empty stomach until the midday meal, and so begins your day. Miserable, cold, and already exhausting, and you've only just opened your eyes. The first thing you notice is the cold. Not the brisk kind of cold you might feel stepping outside on a winter morning, but the sort that wraps itself around your bones, that seeps through the earth and up through your straw mattress, that clings to your skin like a second, damp garment. You are lying on a lumpy, uneven pile of straw inside a small, timber-framed hut. The roof is low, patched with moss, and in many places, the thatch is thin enough that the dew leaks through. You sit up, and your breath immediately fogs in the air. There's no fireplace in the center of the room, just a simple hearth, a stone-lined pit, where the fire has long gone out. Last night, you huddled beside its embers, hoping the fading warmth would carry you through. It didn't. Your limbs ache from the hard ground. Your fingers are stiff. And if you were lucky enough to have a single blanket, it now smells of damp wool and smoke. There are no windows, only slits in the walls where light can barely filter in. The light is grey. A thin, wintry dawn. The coals are cold. You'll need to start a fire from scratch using whatever dry kindling might be left from yesterday if it didn't. Get wet in the storm that passed overnight. You gather the twigs carefully, hands fumbling, ears already picking up the subtle creaks and rustles of animals waking outside. The cow in the lean-to is restless. The chickens are scratching at the dirt. The goat bleats irritably. They are hungry, and so are you. But there is no breakfast waiting. You scoop a crust of hard bread from the shelf, it has more mold than mealland. Break it in half. If you had a bit of broth left, you could soften the bread. But you ate it all last night, scraping the pot clean. So instead, you chew the bread slowly, using the edge of a dull knife to chip the mold away. It is hard work for tired jaws. You've eaten worse though, much worse. Outside, the world is muddy. The floor of the hut is muddy. Your tunic smells faintly of mildew and smoke, and your undergarments, if you're wearing any, are rough and scratchy against your skin. There's no soap, no water for a morning wash. You rub your hands with a bit of sand and straw to get the grime off. That's all you can do. You'll go to the well later if it hasn't frozen over. The smell of manure, damp straw, wood smoke and mold clings to everything. You don't even notice it anymore. But if you were a modern person suddenly thrust into this hut, the stench would be overwhelming. You're already late. The sun is climbing, and the fields wait. The Lord's bailiff will be coming soon to make sure you've started your day's work. If you're not seen in the barley fields by the time the rooster crows again, you'll be marked absent. That means a fine, or worse, the loss of your next week's grain ration. You tie your belt, wrap a scrap of wool over your head, and step outside. The air is colder than the inside. You breathe deeply, and the frost stings your lungs. Welcome to your morning. You've only just begun and already, you're exhausted. If you ever dreamed of being part of a medieval household, whether rich or poor, you'd soon find yourself overwhelmed not by the glamour of courtly manners or grand banquets but by the sheer, inescapable stench of daily life. Sanitation as we know it simply did not exist. Chamber pots, often overflowing by dawn, were kept beneath beds or under stairwells, and emptied not into sewage systems, but hurled out of upper windows into the narrow streets below. The phrase gardez l'eau, French for watch out for the water, was shouted in warning, but it wasn't always heeded in time. A day in a medieval town meant dodging more than beggars and cartwheels. You had to be alert for falling filth. Inside, life wasn't any cleaner. Even the wealthiest households teemed with lice, fleas, and bedbugs. Mattresses, often made of straw or feathers, were breeding grounds for all kinds of vermin. Linen was rarely changed, wool garments were rarely washed, and even the grandest lord might reek of unwashed skin, and rancid oils used to tame the hair and beard. Servants tried to mask smells with herbs, lavender in the summer, rosemary in the winter, but there was no escaping the thick, ever-present human odor, and the irony, the stink of your clothes was often a sign of status. A strong perfume of sweat, spices, and furs indicated that you didn't perform labor, you had others do it for you. Peasants might wash themselves in rivers now and then, but noble women bathed infrequently, if ever, to avoid illness. Water was considered dangerous, a gateway to disease, especially when warm. Physicians warned against it. You, stepping into this world, would likely recoil. It would not just be the smell that overwhelms you, but the way no one else seems to mind it. The nose adjusts, but not quickly enough. The stale reek of bodies, old food, manure, and mold would cling to your lungs. No candles, no incense, no fresh air from an open window would provide relief. Even the church, with its high ceilings and holy airs, could smell like mildew, damp stone, and ancient sweat. After just a few hours, your stomach would churn. By nightfall, you'd be dizzy from the musty claustrophobia of it all. And by morning, assuming you made it through the night without a rat scurrying across your chest, you might already be dreaming of soap and hot showers. But neither would come. Not in this world. Not for a very long time. Let's imagine you've made it through your first filthy night in the medieval world. You're stiff from sleeping on a straw mattress, likely itchy from lice, and your nose still hasn't recovered from the ever-present stink. But now comes another challenge, one you probably didn't expect. Eat it. You might think, how bad could it be? Bread, stew, maybe a bit of roasted meat. But this wasn't some rustic medieval feast from a storybook. This was the daily grind of food insecurity, strange flavors, questionable hygiene, and nutritional chaos. If you were poor, and statistically, you'd start your day not with breakfast but with hunger. Breakfast wasn't a proper meal for most peasants. If you were lucky, there might be yesterday's coarse black bread left over, dry and hard enough to chip a tooth. No butter, no jam, no coffee, maybe a bit of weak ale, brewed with herbs, just enough to give you the strength to reach the fields or workshops. Lunch, if it existed at all, might be a watery potager, thin soup of boiled grains and whatever vegetables hadn't yet rotted. On feast days, a bit of salt pork or dried fish might appear, but for most of the year, meat was a rare luxury, and vegetables were no fresh farmer's market delight either. They were often old, stored improperly, or cooked until they turned to mush. Salt was precious. Spices were for the elite, sugar exotic and almost mythic. Dairy could be dangerous if spoiled, and eggs were precious enough that they were sometimes used as currency. Most peasants ate around 2,000 calories a day, mostly from starches, bread, beans, oats, and almost none of it was satisfying. Now, if you were a noble, the story wasn't much better. Yes, you'd be surrounded by servants laying platters and pouring spiced wine. But meals were a bizarre ritual of status rather than nourishment. You'd eat while sitting uncomfortably upright, surrounded by noise, smells, and flies, tearing meat with your hands and wiping your fingers on tablecloths or the back of your sleeve. There were no forks, just knives, spoons, and fingers. Hygiene was an afterthought, and the food overcooked, overspiced, and often far too salty. Meats were preserved with heavy brining, sometimes cooked days after death, their freshness masked by sauces of vinegar, ginger, or mustard. Fruit pies were rare, and fresh vegetables were considered poor man's food. Nobles avoided leafy greens, believing them to cause melancholy or bloating. You'd feel heavy after eating, but not full in the way you're used to. Your stomach would rebel against the strange combinations, stews, pickled eels, sweetmeats, and boiled cabbage all on one wooden plate. Water was rarely trusted to drink, so you'd wash it down with weak ale or wine, even at breakfast. By nightfall, you'd be craving a crisp apple, a cold glass of milk, or anything with actual flavor that didn't taste like rot or mold. You'd dream of a refrigerator, of takeout, of seasoning that didn't come with a side of food poisoning. Eating in the medieval world wasn't joyful. It was survival. It was routine, repetitive, and punishing. And tomorrow you'd wake up hungry again. You somehow managed to eat your way through a gritty, medieval day. Dry bread, lumpy stew, perhaps some bitter ale. And then comes the moment every modern person dreads when imagining the past. What happens when you need the toilet? Let's be honest. The concept of a clean, private bathroom simply didn't exist for most of the medieval world. You might find it shocking just how public, unpleasant, and downright filthy the act of relieving oneself truly was. In fact, it's one of the many reasons you wouldn't last a day in this era. Let's start in the village. If you were a peasant, you didn't have a toilet, you had the outdoors, fields, ditches, behind your house, or a communal cesspit, at best. There was no toilet paper, not even leaves sometimes. Moss, straw, or just a handful of grass might do the trick, if anything at all. In winter, with snow on the ground, imagine pulling down your layers, squatting behind your hut in the icy wind, and hoping you wouldn't step in someone else's mess. There was no privacy, and there was certainly no dignity. If your home had a chamber pot, a wide ceramic or wooden bowl kept under the bed, you might use that instead, especially at night. But then came the question, what do you do with it in the morning? Simple, you'd toss it into the street. Yes, really. Open your window, give a half-hearted shout of Gardielu if you were in medieval Scotland, and out it went, onto the cobblestones below. Now imagine walking to market the next morning, trying not to step in yesterday's waste, dodging both human and animal filth, watching rats scurry from gutters clogged with rot and runoff. Sanitation was so poor that the streets reeked constantly, a pungent blend of urine, feces, horse droppings, fish guts, and mud. You might long for a fresh breeze, but even the air smelled old and damp. In castles things were a little more sophisticated, but not much more pleasant. Privies were built into the stone walls, narrow, dark chutes called garderobes, a wooden bench with a hole lead to a vertical shaft that emptied into the moat or a cesspit below. But the smell, overpowering, and since there was no flushing system, it simply piled up, layer upon layer of waste, crawling with maggots and swarming with flies. The noble solution to odor: hang your clothing in the garderobe. Seriously, it was believed the strong stench would ward off moths. Imagine donning a fur-lined cloak that had been marinating in latrine fumes all night. For women, especially noble women in long dresses and corsetry, using the toilet was a laborious, undignified task. Servants might have to help them undress just to squat over a chamber pot. During long church services or royal ceremonies, people sometimes wore special garments that allowed them to relieve themselves while standing or sitting. Yes, medieval adult diapers were a thing, and when it came to hand washing, good luck. Soap was rare and expensive. Most people didn't wash after going to the toilet. Germ theory didn't exist. You could easily fall ill from contaminated hands, food, or water. Dysentery, cholera, and intestinal parasites were constant companions. In short, using the bathroom in the medieval world was an ordeal. There was no comfort, no cleanliness, and no privacy. Only a grim necessity endured with gritted teeth and averted eyes. So, you've made it through the food, the filth, and the cold. But one wrong move, a slip on a wet stone, a rusty nail in your boot, or even a badly pulled tooth, and suddenly, you're in very serious trouble, because in the medieval world, even a minor injury could lead to agony, or death. Let's say you nicked your hand while chopping firewood. Today you'd wash it, maybe apply a little antiseptic, slap on a bandage, and be done. Back then, first of all, there's no clean water, no soap, no knowledge of bacteria. That little cut, it festered, the edges turned red, it swelled with pus, and that stabbing pain running up your arm, blood poisoning. There were no antibiotics, no real hospitals, and the word sterile wasn't even in the vocabulary. If you were lucky, someone might bind the wound with a strip of linen, likely reused from another patient. If you were unlucky, you'd be taken to a barber surgeon, a man who cut hair and limbs, with the same dull, unwashed tools. Let's take a closer look at that medieval clinic. The room is dim and drafty, wooden tables, stained with blood, iron tools hanging on the walls, forceps, saws, orcs, none of them cleaned between uses. You're offered some ale or a piece of leather to bite down on, because there's no anesthesia. Then, without warning, the surgeon digs into your infected hand, hoping to let out the bad humors. You scream, writhe, pass out. Afterward, they might apply a salve made of herbs, honey, or even animal dung. Yes, Dung was considered a useful antiseptic by some. Leeches could be applied to balance the blood. You're wrapped in bandages, soaked in lard or wine, and sent home to recover. But the infection doesn't go away. The fever starts. You're sweating, shivering, delirious, and if you don't die, you might lose the hand, or the entire arm. Toothaches were another medieval nightmare. No dentistry, no fillings, just endless, aching pain. Teeth rotted in your mouth, turned black, and fell out. When the agony became unbearable, the village blacksmith or barber might yank it out with pliers, cracking the tooth in pieces, or pulling part of the jaw with it. No numbing, no follow-up care, just a scream, a gush of blood, and the hope that it wouldn't get infected. Broken bones, splintered with wood, if you were lucky. Otherwise, they were left to set crooked. A badly broken leg could mean a lifetime limp. Compound fractures often led to gangrene, which meant amputation, performed without anesthesia, and often without washing the sore. Mental illness, seizures, or strokes were treated as spiritual afflictions. Demonic possession, curses, you might be bled, whipped, or exorcised. There were no asylums with any real care, just shackles, prayers, and dark cells. Even childbirth, something natural and constant, was perilous. Many women died giving birth. Many infants died days later. There were midwives, yes, some incredibly skilled, but they had no way to handle a breech baby, a hemorrhage, or a placenta that refused to come. A difficult birth meant agony, and often death. There was no understanding of viruses, no knowledge of sanitation. Doctors relied on astrology, bad smells, and colored urine. You might be prescribed crushed pearls, mercury, or moldy bread. And the church, powerful and ever-present, sometimes declared illness a punishment from God. So instead of help, you were offered penance. In the medieval world, your body was never safe. Pain was constant, illness was everywhere, and medicine, while occasionally helpful, was just as likely to kill you as save you. One small wound could be your death sentence. You might imagine a medieval city as quaint and charming. Narrow lanes, timber-bird houses, bustling markets. But step back in time and place your feet on one of those cobbled roads, and the charm quickly fades. The stench alone would have you retching, because the truth is, medieval cities were some of the filthiest, most hazardous places to live, and they were death traps in disguise. Let's start with the roads. They weren't paved in most places, especially not in the poorer districts. Instead, they were a mix of packed dirt, crumbling stone, and an ever-present slick layer of mud and waste. Human waste, animal waste, rotten food, urine, blood, ashes, dead rats, and even the occasional decomposing carcass. People tossed their chamber pots right into the street, from windows above. Some shouted a warning gardilu. In parts of medieval Britain, others didn't bother. You could be walking along, half asleep, half hungry, and suddenly find yourself covered in someone else's filth. The city never smelled clean. In summer, the stench intensified until breathing through your nose became unbearable. Horses and livestock shared these roads with people. Pigs snuffled through piles of garbage. Dogs fought over bones. Chickens darted between carts, and nobody cleaned it up. There were no garbage trucks, no sanitation crews. Some cities had laws requiring people to clean the area in front of their homes, but few obeyed, and fewer enforced it. Rain made things worse. The roads turned to slurry. Carts became stuck. People slipped and fell into the muck. Diseases spread icily in these conditions: cholera, dysentery, typhus. But no one understood why. They blamed bad air, or miasmas, not the open sewage running down every alley. Public latrines, rare, and when they did exist, they were foul, overflowing, and dangerous. Sometimes they were built over rivers or cesspits that backed up. In London, the River Fleet was once a freshwater stream, but by the Middle Ages it had turned black with human waste, dead animals, and butchers' offal. Now imagine living next to that. Water was drawn from wells, rivers, or rain barrels, often contaminated. The same river used to dump sewage was used for bathing, washing clothes, and even drinking. Boiling wasn't common practice unless it was for brewing beer or making stew. Dysentery could take down a household in days, and it was often fatal, especially for children. Then there were fires. Buildings made of wood and thatch stood cheek by jowl with open flames for cooking, heating, and lighting. One gust of wind could turn a cooking accident into a citywide blaze. Entire districts could be wiped out before the fire ran out of fuel, and what of the air? In wealthier cities, tanneries lined the edges, filling the air with the acrid reek of urine-soaked hides. Blacksmiths filled the sky with smoke. Butchers drained blood into the streets. candle makers boiled animal fat. It was a symphony of industrial stench. There was no regulation, no zoning, just an overwhelming assault on your senses. Then came plague. With no understanding of how disease spread, people huddled closer in fear. They blamed foreigners, cats, sin, anything but the truth. And the bodies piled up in the worst outbreaks. Carts would roll down the streets collecting corpses, their bells ringing through the night. Mass graves were dug outside the walls. People fled if they could, but many were too poor, or too sick, to leave. Living in a medieval city was not just uncomfortable, it was often lethal. Sanitation was non-existent, disease was constant, and unless you were extremely lucky, or extremely rich, the city you called home was slowly killing you. There was no escape from the filth. You breathed it, drank it, lived in it, and eventually you died in it. If you got sick in medieval times, and it wasn't a matter of if, but when, your best hope might have been to do nothing at all, because medieval medicine, as practiced for most people, was a nightmarish blend of superstition, guesswork, and sheer brutality. There were no antibiotics, no painkillers, and almost no understanding of how the human body actually worked. What you'd face instead was a system that was just as likely to harm you as to help. Let's start with diagnosis. Medieval doctors believed in the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile. Illness was seen as an imbalance of these bodily fluids, and the treatments were meant to restore balance, often violently. If you had a fever, too much blood, so you'd be bled. With a knife, a leech, or a heated glass cup, you'd lie back while a physician or barber surgeon opened a vein, and you'd be left weaker, paler, and sometimes on the edge of death. But if you survived the bleeding, they considered it a success. For a cold or cough, they might induce vomiting or diarrhea, purging your system with herbs like hellebore or scammony, poisonous in large amounts. Boils and infected wounds were treated by lancing them with dirty knives, followed by poultices of moldy bread, sheep dung, or mashed up herbs. It often made things worse. Surgery was a last resort, but when it was needed, it was crude and excruciating. No anesthesia, no sterile tools. A broken leg might be reset with splints, but if the bone pierced the skin or became infected, amputation was the only hope. A surgeon would hold you down, give you a stick to bite, and cut off the limb with a saw, quickly, before you bled out or went into shock. Toothache. The local barber might yank the tooth out with iron pincers while you screamed. No antiseptic, no numbing agent, just grit and agony. If you had a mental illness or seizures, it was often blamed on demons or sin. You could be sent to a monastery for prayers, or worse, chained, beaten, or subjected to exorcisms. Women, in particular, were vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft if they exhibited strange behavior or unexplained symptoms. Hospitals existed, but they weren't like modern institutions. They were more like religious hostels, run by monks or nuns who focused on prayer rather than treatment. Beds were shared, food was minimal, and disease spread quickly. Sometimes, people went to hospitals just to die with dignity and have their souls cared for. Plague was met with desperation. Doctors in long-beaked masks stuffed with herbs might walk through the streets, but they offered little more than fear and false hope. Herbal remedies, incense, fasting, and whipping oneself were common responses. The idea of washing hands or isolating the sick wasn't widely understood or practiced. Even childbirth, the most natural thing in the world, was a deadly gamble. Midwives did their best, but complications like breech births, hemorrhaging, or infections often meant death for mother, baby, or both. C-sections were almost always fatal unless done post-mortem to save the child. Many women died in childbed, and those who didn't lived in fear of the next pregnancy. If you were wealthy, you had a better chance. Private physicians, cleaner conditions, and more nourishing food made recovery more likely. But even kings and nobles died from infected wounds, abscessed teeth, and simple fevers. Medicine didn't discriminate, and often it just didn't work. The average peasant had to rely on folk remedies passed down from ancestors, poultices of cabbage leaves, charms, prayer beads, and a lot of luck. Sometimes, these worked better than what the university-trained physicians offered. In the end, surviving illness in the medieval world wasn't about medicine. It was about resilience, timing, and often pure chance. If you lived long enough to grow old, with your own teeth, decent eyesight, and a relatively straight back, you were a rare exception. Because in a world without understanding, healing often hurt more than the disease. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon in medieval times, the world didn't get quieter, it just changed shape. For the average person, nighttime wasn't a peaceful retreat into slumber, it was often a grim, uncomfortable ordeal. Sleep in the medieval world was not like the cozy, insulated experience we know today. Instead, it was broken, cold, noisy, and often unsafe. Let's begin with the basics. Where you slept. If you were a peasant, your bed might be a pile of straw on the floor of a one-room cottage shared with your entire family. And sometimes your animals, chickens might roost in the rafters. A pig might be tied to a post. The cow might be snoring softly in the corner. It smelled thick in the air, and the floor beneath you would be packed earth, cold, slightly damp, and home to all manner of insects. The straw mattress, infested with lice and fleas. There were no sheets, no pillows, unless you rolled up your cloak, and certainly no such thing as privacy. Parents, children, even extended relatives. Everyone slept within arm's reach of each other. Whispered prayers and quiet sobbing from stomach cramps might be the last things you heard before you drifted off, if you could sleep at all. There were no glass windows in most homes, just wooden shutters or cloth to keep the wind out, which meant that the winter air, sharp, damp, and penetrating, seeped into your bones as you tried to stay warm under coarse, itchy woolen blankets or furs. If you were lucky, you'd decurl up next to the fire, but the fire might go out halfway through the night. Reigniting it in the dark wasn't easy. Flint and steel were unreliable, and matches didn't exist. In towns and cities, sleep was even less restful. The streets outside echoed with the sounds of drunken brawls, barking dogs, and the clatter of carts on uneven cobblestones. There was no insulation to dull the sound. Thin wooden walls or waterlandop kept little more than rain out, and if your neighbors were arguing, or worse, you heard every word. Then there were the dangers. Thieves might creep through poorly barred doors. Rats and mice would scurry along the floor and across rafters. Bedbugs, lice, and fleas crawled across your skin. Mosquitoes, drawn by the stink of people and animals, bit your exposed flesh as you slept. And of course, there were the dreams. Medieval people were deeply superstitious. Nightmares weren't just bad dreams. They were visitations from spirits, demons, or ghosts. Waking in the night with a start, covered in sweat, heart racing. It wasn't simply anxiety. It was, they believed, a sign of being watched by something unseen. The old hag, a folkloric creature said to sit on your chest and steal your breath, was one explanation for sleep paralysis, which many medieval people feared as a demonic attack. Interestingly, sleep was also segmented. People often went to bed shortly after nightfall, then woke up in the middle of the night for an hour or two. This first sleep and second sleep pattern meant that the middle of the night might be spent praying, tending the fire, or even chatting with others who'd also woken. But for those plagued with fears or physical pain, it was just more time to lie awake, staring at the darkness. Candles were a luxury. Oil lamps were smoky, fragile, and expensive to maintain. Most peasants simply lived in the dark, navigating by memory or moonlight if they had to rise during the night, perhaps to relieve themselves in a bucket or walk out to the cold latrine in the yard. Those with more wealth might fare better. Beds with wooden frames, thick feather mattresses, curtains to keep in warmth and privacy, servants to stoke fires, prepare hot stones to warm sheets. But even nobility had no true peace. Bedchambers were often drafty, with howling winds slipping through cracks in the stonework, and diseases like gout, ulcers, or toothaches kept many up in misery. In short, medieval sleep wasn't restful. It was interrupted, uncomfortable, and frequently haunted by pain, pests, and the fear of the unknown. People didn't wake up refreshed. They woke stiff, cold, itchy, and sore, dragging themselves back into the hard demands of daily survival. And as they rubbed their eyes and relit the hearth, they knew. The worst part was, the next night would be exactly the same. Let's talk about something no one in medieval times could avoid, no matter their status. Something utterly mundane, yet profoundly unpleasant, relieving oneself. You might think that for all the discomforts of medieval life, going to the toilet would be at least straightforward, but it wasn't. It was one of the most consistently miserable, unsanitary, and humiliating parts of daily existence. Start with the peasantry. If you lived in a rural village, as most people did, there were no flush toilets. There weren't even outhouses in the modern sense. You might have a basic wooden structure with a hole dug into the ground, sometimes shared by several families, but many just squatted outside, behind a hedge or near a dung heap. Imagine this on a freezing January morning, your body aching, the air sharp with frost, and the ground slippery with mud and waste, the cold biting into your exposed skin. No toilet paper, of course, just moss, leaves, or a rag if you were lucky. The smell, overpowering, not just from your own bodily functions, but from everyone else's. In many villages, human waste was collected with animal dung and spread as fertilizer. The stench hung in the air constantly, particularly in warmer months. Flies were everywhere. Hygiene, at best, was an afterthought. Now consider the chamber pot, a staple in most homes. This was a simple pot, often made of clay or metal, kept under the bed or in the corner of the room. At night, or when it was too cold or dangerous to go outside, this is where you did your business. In the morning, someone, usually a woman or servant, would take it outside and dump it, often right into the street, or into a designated cesspit if one existed. In towns, it was common to hear cries of gardilu, a warning shout before waste was hurled from a window. If you were unlucky enough to be walking below, well, you'd learn to keep your mouth closed and your hat on. Cities like London and Paris were dotted with open sewers called kennels, shallow trenches where waste flowed openly down the streets. These became clogged easily, especially when people threw not just urine and feces, but also animal parts, spoiled food, and all manner of rot into them. The result was predictable: puddles of filth, clouds of insects, and a near-permanent reek that clung to your clothes and skin. But perhaps you think the wealthy had it better. In some ways, yes. But comfort was relative. Castles had garderobes, medieval toilets built into the walls. They were essentially stone or wooden seats with a hole that opened into a chute leading outside, often directly into the moat or a pit. These chutes could clog, overflow, or freeze solid in winter. Worse, they let in cold air, and even vermin, rats, frogs, and insects could climb up. Some unfortunate souls were even bitten mid. The smell was so constant that wealthy individuals sometimes kept aromatic herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint near their toilets, just to make the experience slightly less revolting. But nothing could fully mask the smell of centuries of waste fermenting in the bowels of a stone fortress. Even monasteries and nunneries, places of religious discipline and ritual cleanliness, had crude toilet blocks. Communal latrines built over running water channels helped carry waste away. But without modern plumbing, these too became clogged and foul. Maintenance required manual labor. Imagine the monastic novice tasked with scraping hardened filth from stone channels in the name of purity. Diseases were rampant. Flies carried filth from waste to food. People rarely washed their hands. Dysentery, cholera, and intestinal parasites were a regular part of life. You could die from drinking water contaminated with human waste. A common occurrence when wells were placed too close to latrines. Women faced special challenges. During menstruation, there were no pads or tampons. Rags were reused if they were used at all, and washing them posed its own problems. Public shame and silence surrounded women's hygiene. Even childbirth, a deeply messy and dangerous process, occurred without any real sanitation. The blood and waste of birth soaked into straw-stuffed mattresses or rush-covered floors, cleaned only with water and cloths reused many times over. And yet people carried on. They adapted. They squatted in fields. They used communal latrines. They emptied chamber pots. They tolerated the smells, the sights, the indignity. Because there was no other option. This was life. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't noble. It was a relentless, visceral dance with discomfort. So if you imagine yourself in medieval times, strolling through cobbled streets or standing proudly atop a castle wall, don't forget this part: the outhouse, the chamber pot, the stench that never truly faded. This was as much a part of medieval life as feasts, battles, or prayers. And if you couldn't stomach it, if you recoiled from the filth and the flies, well, you might not last a day. If you think going to the gym is hard work, imagine this: waking up before dawn, stepping outside into the icy dark in bare feet or wooden clogs your stomach hollow from lack of food, your back already sore from yesterday's toil, and knowing that the real work hasn't even begun yet. Life for a medieval peasant was defined by one word: labor. Endless, grueling, punishing labor, especially for those who worked the land, which was most of them. Forget quaint notions of pastoral life. The idyllic image of a medieval village with cheerful peasants and sun-dappled fields was far from the truth. Farming was survival, and survival was agony. Your tools, primitive, heavy iron-tipped wooden plows pulled by oxen, if you were lucky enough to have access to them. Otherwise the plowing was done with a mattock or spade, by hand. Fields were not flat or evenly furrowed. They were rocky, wet, overgrown. You'd spend hours bent double, hacking into dense earth hardened by frost or baked by summer sun. all while covered in mud and sweat. The soil often refused to cooperate. You could dig for hours and still have weeds and poor crop returns. Then came the planting. Seeds had to be scattered precisely, not too shallow or deep, then harrowed, dragged over by spiked boards or bundles of brush to cover them. If you dropped or wasted seeds, it meant less food for winter. Every handful mattered. Harvest time brought its own torment. Using sickles, curved iron blades with crude wooden handles, you crouch low and cut stalk after stalk of wheat, barley, or rye. This took days, weeks. Your hands bled from the serrated edge and the sharp husks. Your back ached from bending. You worked in the beating sun with no shade, swatting flies and trying to ignore the sting of sweat dripping into your eyes. Then came threshing, beating the grain from the chaff with a flail, a rhythmic, brutal task that tested your coordination and your endurance. After that, winnowing, tossing the grain into the air to let the wind separate it from the chaff. Dust filled your lungs, your arms trembled, and you still weren't finished. The fields needed constant maintenance, weeds pulled, stones removed, ditches dug to drain water, boundaries reinforced with wooden stakes and thorny hedges, and all of this was done manually. No machinery, no brakes, no choice. Even outside the growing season, the work never stopped. In winter, you might be sent to clear snow, chop firewood, tend animals, or repair fences and roofs. In spring, you helped birth livestock, hauled manure, and patched roads. Every single task was essential, and failing to do it meant hunger or death. Women didn't escape the grind. They worked the fields alongside men, often with infants strapped to their backs. And when the day's labor ended, they returned to chores, grinding grain by hand with heavy stones, baking bread in communal ovens, fetching water from distant wells, spinning wool, sewing clothes, and preparing meals, all with primitive tools. Children worked too. From as young as 5, they chased birds from crops, carried water, picked stones from fields, and helped herd animals. By 10 or 12, they were expected to do nearly as much as an adult. Injury was common and dangerous. A twisted ankle, a deep cut, a broken finger. These were not mere inconveniences. They could mean a complete inability to work. And if you couldn't work, you didn't eat. There were no workers' rights, no sick days, no compensation. If a laborer collapsed in the field, they might be dragged to the edge and left in the shade. But the harvest wouldn't stop for them, and the Lord still expected his due. If you were a serf, much of your labor wasn't even for your own survival. You were legally bound to your Lord's land, forced to farm his fields a few days each week, in addition to tending your own. He could take a portion of your harvest, demand extra work, or levy taxes in coin or in kind, like livestock, grain, or cloth. The physical toll was immense. Men in their 30s looked like they were 50. Women lost their teeth and their hair early. Backs were hunched. Skin was weathered like leather. Arthritis, joint pain, hernias, all were common by midlife, and there were no doctors, no painkillers, no surgeries. You lived with your injuries, or you died of them. Rest was rare. The church declared certain feast days and holy days when work was theoretically prohibited. But most peasants used that time to catch up on personal tasks. True rest, the kind where you simply sit, breathe, and do nothing, was a luxury virtually unknown to the lower classes. This was the daily reality of medieval farm life. No safety net, no shortcuts, just dawn-to-dusk labor, season after season, year after year. And all of it performed with a body that was constantly in pain, often undernourished, and prematurely aged. Could you survive it? Could you rise before the sun, toil with cracked hands and aching knees, return home after dark with nothing but a crust of bread, and do it again the next day, and the next, and the next, for decades? For most modern people, the answer is simple. You wouldn't last a week. But in the medieval world, this was life. Not exceptional, not extreme, just normal, just expected. Picture this. You're covered in sweat, mud, manure, fleas, and soot after a long day of medieval labor. Your body aches, your skin itches, your hair is matted with grease. You desperately want a bath. You need one. But in the Middle Ages, bathing wasn't just rare. It was a challenge, often unpleasant, sometimes dangerous, and always inconvenient. Let's start with the basics. There was no running water. Not in your home, not in your village, not even in castles. Water had to be fetched manually, usually from a river, stream, or well. This meant carrying heavy wooden buckets or ceramic jugs, back and forth, over and over again, heating that water. Another ordeal. Firewood was precious. Starting a fire required skill, patience, and time. To heat enough water for a full bath could take hours, and by the time it was ready, it might already be tepid. Most peasants didn't bathe often, perhaps only a few times a year, if that. When they did, they typically used wooden tubs lined with linen to prevent splinters. These were shallow and small. You sat with your knees bent tightly against your chest while someone poured water over your back, assuming you weren't just standing in a bucket, splashing yourself awkwardly. Soap, if you had it, was rough and lye-based, harsh on the skin and eyes. It stung, it dried you out, and for many, it simply didn't exist. And here's a grim fact. The same bathwater was reused, often by multiple people. First the father, then the mother, then the children, in descending order of rank. By the time the youngest had their turn, the water was murky, lukewarm, and swirling with filth. And that's if a family even bathed together at all. Many didn't bother. A quick rinse of the face, hands and feet was considered enough. The rest could wait. In cities, things were different, but not necessarily better. Public bathhouses did exist, especially in earlier medieval centuries, influenced by Roman traditions. These were communal spaces where men and women might bathe together, separated by hours or screens depending on local customs. They became places not only for washing but also for socializing, eating, and, in some cases, illicit activities. But over time, the church began to frown on such establishments. The mixing of naked bodies, the association with sin and temptation, the fear of vanity and pride, all clashed with Christian ideals. By the later Middle Ages, many public baths were shut down or viewed with suspicion. Add to that the arrival of plagues and disease, and fears grew that bathing might actually open the pores and let sickness in. Some physicians even advised against washing entirely, believing that the protective layer of dirt kept illness out. Instead of bathing, many relied on dry cleaning, not with machines, but with cloths and powders. People might rub their skin with rough linen, scrape away dead skin with blunt knives, or apply herbs and crushed flowers to mask their odor. Perfumed sachets were tucked into clothes. Hair was dusted with flour or chalk to absorb oil. In wealthier households, scented oils or rosewater might be used sparingly, but these were luxuries beyond the reach of most. And what of the clothes? Linen undergarments absorbed sweat and were changed more often, but outer garments, heavy woolen tunics, cloaks, and dresses, were rarely washed. They were brushed, beaten, and aired out, but actual laundering was infrequent, difficult, and costly. Washing clothes meant hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing with ash or soap, then wringing out sodden, heavy fabrics by hand. It took a full day's work. For women, hygiene was even harder. Menstruation was a private struggle, managed with woolen pads, cloth rags, or nothing at all. There were no modern products, no pain relief, no privacy. The smells, stains, and discomfort were endured in silence. If you were a servant or laborer, you had to keep working through it, without pause. And consider the effects on health. Skin infections, lice infestations, fungal issues. These were rampant wounds, festered, sores went untreated, itchy rashes spread, scabies and boils were common, fleas, bedbugs and mites thrived. The constant itch was a part of daily life, as normal as breathing. Cleanliness wasn't just a challenge in the Middle Ages, it was a battle, a never-ending, mostly losing struggle against dirt, disease, and discomfort. And yet, people endured. They adapted, they managed. But for you, dropped into this world with your 21st century expectations, the smell alone might send you running. The effort needed for one bath might break you. And the idea of going weeks, even months, without properly washing, let's be honest, you wouldn't last long. Let's imagine it's finally nightfall in your medieval village. The sun has disappeared, casting your world into a deep, quiet darkness. The day's labor is over. Your back aches, your hands are blistered, and your stomach is barely full from a meager supper of stale bread and thin pottage. You're re-exhausted physically and mentally, and all you want to do is collapse into bed. But sleep, in the medieval world, was not a refuge of comfort. It was just another challenge. Your bed, if you're lucky enough to have one, is not what you'd expect. For most peasants, it's a rough wooden frame, or, more commonly, a simple straw mattress thrown on the floor. This mattress, called a pallet, is stuffed with straw, reeds, or even dried heather, bound together in coarse linen or wool. It smells of mildew, sometimes of animals. It's flattened by constant use and filled with bugs, fleas, lice, mites. No sheets, no pillows, no comfort, and you're not sleeping alone. Families, especially poor ones, often shared the same sleeping space. Children slept next to parents. Siblings huddled together. Sometimes even livestock were brought inside the home at night to keep warm or for protection. Chickens might roost in a corner. A goat could be tied near the hearth. The family pig might grunt softly just a few feet away from your face. And the smell, a pungent blend of unwashed bodies, animal waste, smoke, and mold. It's cold, bone cold. Your only source of heat, a dying fire in the hearth, barely reaches the edges of the room. There's no insulation in your Waterlandop walls. The wind whistles through every crack. In winter, your breath fogs in the air above you. You sleep in your clothes, all of them, layered and stiff, with a rough wool blanket or animal pelt wrapped around your shoulders. Still, you shiver. There is no silence in the medieval night. Your neighbors argue through paper-thin walls. Dogs bark outside. Someone coughs, someone snores. Church bells toll the hours. And if you live in a town or near the road, the sounds of travelers, drunks, or the town watch patrolling might break the quiet. You might even hear distant wolves howling, owls hooting, or the eerie creak of trees swaying in the dark. And then there are the pests. Rats scurry along the floorboards and climb the beams above your head. Insects crawl under your clothes. Bedbugs feed in the warmth of your body. You itch, constantly. The straw mattress rustles with every move, and you know it harbors more than just you. You might drift off eventually, but sleep comes in phases. In the medieval world, people commonly practiced segmented sleep, to separate periods of rest, with a waking hour in between. After a few hours of rest, you'd awaken in the middle of the night. Some used this time to pray. Others checked on the fire, visited neighbors, or even had a quiet meal. After this first sleep, they would eventually settle back down for their second sleep. But for you, unaccustomed to this rhythm, it's disorienting. You're awake, shivering, staring into the pitch black, listening to the groans of your siblings or the clucking of a chicken nearby. Hygiene before bed, non-existent. You didn't brush your teeth. No one did. Your mouth tastes of onions and sour ale. You didn't wash your face, and your hands are still grimy from work. You may have wiped them on your tunic, but the dirt lingers under your nails. You didn't use a bathroom either, not in the way you'd expect. If you needed to relieve yourself, you used a chamber pot under the bed, or went outside to the communal latrine, in the cold, in the dark. And don't forget the superstition. The medieval night was a realm of fears and spirits. People believed the darkness belonged to the devil, to witches, to demons. Evil things crept at night, and even dreams could be seen as omens. You slept with charms for protection, a cross under your pillow, a prayer murmured before lying down, perhaps even iron nails hammered into the doorframe to ward off evil. The bed, such as it was, did not offer comfort. It was a place to rest your tired limbs, but it was not restorative. You woke up as tired as you went to sleep, maybe more, with a crick in your neck, a scratch on your leg, or a flea bite that had turned red and angry. You coughed from the smoke lingering in the room, or the damp air in your lungs. But the day was beginning again, chores awaited, and the sun was rising. In the modern world, we romanticize the simplicity of the past. The quiet country nights, the candlelit bedrooms, the hand-woven blankets. But the reality was anything but romantic. In the Middle Ages, sleep was a struggle. You didn't lie down in peace. You collapsed into survival, and by morning, you'd be aching, freezing, itching, and still exhausted. So if you're thinking of drifting into a medieval dreamland, be careful what you wish for. You wake with a dry mouth and a pounding in your skull. Your body aches in places you didn't even know could ache, and your skin is clammy with sweat, yet somehow you're freezing. Something isn't right. In the modern world, you might take a painkiller, drink some water, or call a doctor. But in the medieval world, sickness is no small thing. It's not a passing cold. It's a threat, a shadow that hangs heavy over the poor, the hungry, the weak. Illness begins quietly, a sore throat, a fever. Maybe your joints feel stiff or your stomach twists in knots. But in an age without antibiotics, without vaccinations, without even a basic understanding of germs or contagion, these are signs of something potentially deadly. You don't know it, but you might have the flu, or dysentery, or worse, the plague. To you and your neighbors, it's simply bad air, or a punishment from God, or an imbalance in your humors. There's no medicine in the way we know it, no hospitals that can help. A local wise woman might give you a concoction of herbs and honey, a bitter drink brewed from wormwood, nettles, or elderberry. A barber surgeon may offer to let your blood, believing that sickness is caused by an excess of fluids. They'll slice open your arm and collect your blood in a bowl. You feel weaker, dizzy, but no better. You lie on your straw bed, barely able to move. The fever is relentless now. You drift in and out of sleep, shivering and sweating, your body tangled in a soaked wool blanket. Flies buzz around your face, your breath rattles in your throat. There's no fresh linen, no clean water, just a heavy stink of your own sickness, mixing with the smoky, damp air of your home. If your village is struck with illness, the fear becomes communal. People begin to avoid one another. The market grows quiet. Church bells toll more often. Neighbors speak in hushed tones. Children are kept indoors. And if it's something truly feared, like the plague, doors may be marked. Whole families might disappear into their homes and never come out again. No one brings you soup. No one wears gloves. Hygiene is barely understood. Water is fetched from a communal well, touched by dozens of hands. Waste is dumped into the street outside. Rats run freely. Fleas crawl across your skin. Everything around you is a breeding ground for more sickness. You might pray. Most do. They kneel at your bedside and murmur desperate pleas to saints, to Mary, to Christ himself. They ask for healing, or at least for your suffering to be eased. A priest might visit, offering last rites if things look grim. He presses holy oil to your forehead, his voice soft and steady, the Latin words foreign and haunting. It doesn't mean you'll die, but everyone knows it's a possibility. And even if you survive, the recovery is long and painful. Your muscles waste away from days or weeks in bed. Your appetite is gone. Your work, your only livelihood, has piled up or been taken by someone else. And if you're a serf or peasant, your lord may not care if you were sick. The rent is still due. The fields still need sowing. And if you can't do the work, someone else will take your place. Getting sick in the medieval world is more than a discomfort. It's a trial, a battle without weapons. You're at the mercy of nature, fate, and the superstitions of the time. Your only comforts are prayers, potions, and hope. And that's if you're lucky. For many, a simple fever is the beginning of the end. And in a world where a minor cut can become infected, where childbirth is perilous, and where winter itself can kill, illness is just another grim chapter in the daily struggle to survive. So if you woke up in medieval times and began to feel under the weather, you might never wake up again. Imagine the sticky film of sweat clinging to your skin after a day spent hauling water, tending animals, or working in the fields. Dirt crusts under your fingernails. Your feet ache caked in mud. Your hair is greasy, tangled. Your clothes smell like smoke, sweat, and damp wool. You long for a hot shower, a bar of soap, a moment of privacy. But those luxuries don't exist here. In medieval times, cleanliness was not a daily routine. It was a privilege, and often a rare one. If you were poor, you might bathe only a handful of times each year, perhaps in the spring when rivers thaw, or before Easter or Christmas, as a token of spiritual purification. For most of the year, dirt simply became part of you, embedded in your pores, your scalp, your clothes. Soap was available, in a sense, but it was harsh, made of animal fat, ashes, and lye. Scrubbing with it could leave your skin raw. Many villagers used plain water, maybe scented with herbs if they were lucky enough to have them. But even water itself wasn't always clean. Wells could be contaminated. Streams were often used for both drinking and dumping waste. The idea of germs was unknown. People didn't understand why filth could make them sick. The smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, animal droppings, and stagnant water was simply the scent of daily life. Latrines, if you had one, were little more than a hole in the ground, maybe surrounded by a bit of stone or wood. In cities, chamber pots were emptied out windows into the street below with cries of "Gardez-le" as a half-hearted warning. The filth would splash into the gutters, where pigs might root through it, or where rain might wash it further along the cobbles. To clean your clothes, you'd scrub them in cold water with ashes or stale urine. Yes, urine was a common cleansing agent. The smell lingered, even after drying in the sun. Clothes weren't changed often either. Most peasants owned only 1 or 2 sets, and they were patched and repatched, rarely truly clean. Your hair would be infested with lice before long. Nits would itch along your scalp and neck, and you'd spend your evenings picking through your hair or asking someone else to do it for you. Fleas and bedbugs lived in the straw of your mattress. You might rub rosemary or lavender into your skin to mask the smell and try to repel the pests. But those herbs were expensive or rare. Teeth were cleaned, occasionally, with twigs or cloth. But there were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste. Mouths stank of decay, and toothaches were common. but the underlying filth was the same. Castles stank. Chamber pots overflowed. Fleas knew no class boundaries. Washing your hands before a meal wasn't always about hygiene. It was more about manners. And if you were in the fields or on the road, you often ate with hands still coated in the dust and grime of the day. Medieval people weren't necessarily lazy or careless. They simply lived in a world where cleanliness was difficult, dangerous, and often misunderstood. To get clean required time, fuel, water, and space. Luxuries that most couldn't afford. So if you suddenly found yourself in the Middle Ages, sweating in the summer heat, crawling into a straw bed shared with vermin, feeling grime collect behind your ears and between your toes, you'd quickly learn that staying clean was not a simple matter of willpower. It was a daily, losing battle, and one that your modern senses might not survive for long. Close your eyes and picture this. You're wrapped in a threadbare wool tunic, damp with yesterday's sweat. Your toes are stiff inside cracked leather shoes. Your breath rises in little white clouds. The wind howls outside, but there's no thick glass to block it, no central heating humming behind the walls. Just thin, drafty wooden planks and crumbling stone, through which the winter air slips like a blade. It's the dead of January in the medieval countryside, and the cold isn't just inconvenient, it's dangerous. In the medieval world, winter was a test of survival. There were no heated floors or electric blankets. A fire in the hearth was the center of warmth, and it had to be fed constantly, day and night. If you were poor, you might not even have a proper fireplace, maybe just a hole in the roof to let the smoke escape. Maybe not even that. The smoke would collect in your lungs, making your eyes sting and your chest wheeze. You and your family would huddle together near the fire, not just for comfort, but for life. Body heat was your most reliable resource. You slept close, under coarse blankets or furs, sharing warmth with children, parents, and sometimes animals. In barns, people sometimes brought livestock inside the house, pigs, chickens, even cows, to trap the warmth and keep the animals from freezing to death. The floors were earthen-packed dirt, or cold flagstones, and they radiated the chill up into your bones. You might try to insulate them with rushes or straw, but those would rot and gather vermin. There was no insulation in the walls. The wind whistled through gaps in the boards. Icicles hung from the ceiling beams. You might even wake with frost in your hair. Yes, indoors, keeping warm meant burning wood. But firewood wasn't infinite. You needed time to gather it, tools to cut it, strength to carry it, and luck to find it dry. Many poor families rationed their fuel, saving it for cooking or only using it during the darkest hours of night. Some even resorted to burning peat, dried dung, or old furniture when times were truly desperate. Wool was your best clothing option, if you had it, layer upon layer. You'd never remove anything unless absolutely necessary. And still, the cold seeped in, into your fingers, into your joints, into your breath. There was no escape. Going outdoors was agony. The mud froze into sharp ridges. Your feet cracked with frostbite. Water jugs froze overnight. If you needed to relieve yourself, you had to go outside to a frozen latrine or use a cold chamber pot that might splash onto your skin. Bathing was out of the question. Unless you wanted to risk pneumonia, sickness followed the cold like a shadow. Coughs turned into fevers, fevers into death. There were no antibiotics, no warm hospitals, just superstition, herbal teas, and prayers that your body could endure what the weather inflicted. Even the rich suffered, albeit in more opulent misery. Castles were vast, echoing, freezing places. Fireplaces helped, but only if you sat directly in front of them. The stone walls sucked away warmth. Tapestries were hung on the walls not just for beauty, but to trap heat. Bedchambers were draped in curtains, thick furs were piled on beds, and servants would warm bricks or stones by the fire to tuck under the sheets before sleep. And yet, despite all these efforts, winter was relentless. You couldn't complain. Everyone was cold. Children shivered in silence. Elders huddled near the coals. The sun set early, and you learned to move slowly, to conserve your warmth, your energy, your hope. There were no cheerful songs about winter wonder. Only the knowledge that if the cold didn't kill you outright, it would slowly grind you down. One frozen night at a time. So if you imagine yourself in the medieval world, lighting candles against the dark, holding your hands to a fire that's little more than glowing embers, hearing the wind scream against the thatched roof above you, remember this: the cold was not a passing discomfort. It was the quiet enemy that tested your endurance each year, and claimed those too weak to withstand it. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night with a sharp throbbing pain in your jaw. It starts near one of your back teeth. a dull, nagging ache that grows stronger with each heartbeat. The pain radiates up into your temple, down your neck, until it's all you can feel. You try to ignore it, you press your fingers to your cheek, you clench your jaw, but nothing helps. In the medieval world, this wasn't just an annoying dental problem. A toothache could be the start of a long, agonizing road to death. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no floss. Oral hygiene, for the average medieval person, was little more than rinsing your mouth with water, if you even bothered. Sugar was rare, but bread was coarse and full of grit from millstones, slowly grinding enamel down to the nerve. By the time you were in your 20s, many of your teeth would be cracked, blackened, or entirely gone. And then there was the infection. Without antibiotics, even a minor abscess could become fatal. An infected tooth could swell your face, inflame your gums, and send poison through your bloodstream. There was no sterile environment, no anesthesia, no antibiotics. You might visit the village barber surgeon, the same man who cut hair, bled patients, and performed crude amputations, and he might agree to pull the tooth. No numbing, no gentle technique, just forceps and hope. Or you might not seek help at all, afraid of the pain or the cost or the rumors of people who bled out on the surgeon's table. Instead, you'd chew on cloves, apply poultices of herbs, or press burning hot metal against your gums to draw out the evil. Superstition often stood in place of science. Illness was thought to be a punishment or imbalance, maybe bad humors, maybe a curse, maybe sin. You might be told to confess, to pray, to drink vinegar or wine mixed with crushed insects, and still the pain would grow. A simple cavity could evolve into a bone-deep infection. Your face might swell grotesquely. You might be unable to eat, unable to sleep. If the infection reached your jawbone or sinus, it could trigger fever, delirium, and eventually, sepsis. You wouldn't know what it was. You'd just feel like you were burning from the inside out, in a dark cottage with no pain relief, no antibiotics, and no clean water. You might lie on a straw mattress, moaning, as the infection spread. Family would whisper prayers. There'd be nothing they could do but keep the fire going and watch your face twist in pain. Some people tried early forms of surgery, trepanation, boring a hole into the skull to relieve pressure, cauterization, pressing hot iron to flesh to stop bleeding. The survival rate was slim and the agony unimaginable. Even if you weren't dying, the daily experience of living with chronic pain was something you simply had to endure. No Advil, no Tylenol, no dental clinics or soothing antiseptic rinses. A headache could last days. A backache could ruin your life. Arthritis meant you limped for the rest of your years. And tooth pain, that was one of the worst. Persistent, pounding, and inescapable. The rich might have access to a physician, someone trained in ancient texts, but those doctors rarely understood how the human body truly worked. Many of their treatments were worse than the disease: leeches, bloodletting, purging. If you were lucky, you might find a local herbalist, usually a woman, who could craft a poultice or tea from roots, mosses, or flowers, something to take the edge off. But real relief was rare. And so, you endured. 1 hour at a time, 1 day at a time, until the pain finally faded, or consumed you entirely. So the next time you brush your teeth without thinking, or call the dentist for a quick checkup, consider this. In the medieval world, that small, invisible ache could have ended your life. Slowly, and in excruciating silence, you wake up and your stomach is already hollow. Not just empty from a skipped meal, but truly hollow. The kind of aching emptiness that gnaws at your ribs, saps your strength, and dulls your thoughts. It's not a diet, not a fast, it's famine. And in the medieval world, it was a visitor that came often and stayed too long. Famine wasn't always dramatic. It didn't always arrive with blazing fire or war. Sometimes, it came with a quiet spring frost that ruined the seed grain, or a summer downpour that rotted the fields. Sometimes, it was a long winter that never seemed to end. The cause might be simple: too much rain, too little rain, a locust swarm, or a failed harvest from exhausted soil. But the effect was always the same: hunger. Food supplies in the Middle Ages were fragile. Crops were stored in wooden granaries, vulnerable to mold, mice, and theft. Preserved meats and dried legumes were hoarded like treasure, but spoilage was common. And when stores ran out, they were out. In a modern world, you might walk to the shop, open a fridge, order a meal with your phone. But in a medieval village, no help was coming. There were no supply chains, no supermarkets, no aid trucks or soup kitchens. You had what you grew, what you could store, or what your neighbors were willing to share. And if everyone was hungry, no one had anything left to give. You might try to stretch your food, bake bread with crushed bark, powdered acorns, or sawdust. Make soup from nettles, wild roots, even boiled grass. Some people ate clay, dirt, or leather scraps. The pain of hunger blurred your mind, made you irritable, made you slow, your limbs felt heavy. You walked like your bones were full of lead. And then came the worst of it, watching others starve. Children with sunken eyes and bloated bellies. Old people who simply stopped moving. Mothers giving their last bite to a baby, hoping to get them through one more night. In winter, you'd hear it. The silence, no chopping wood, no chatter, no laughter, just the soft wind and the occasional cry that cut through the cold. There were no safety nets. If you couldn't eat, you simply weakened until you couldn't work, couldn't walk, and eventually couldn't wake. And this wasn't rare. In many parts of Europe, famine struck once or twice a decade. A failed harvest could mean mass starvation. In England alone, between 1315 and 1317, tens of thousands died in the Great Famine. People dug up animal carcasses, others were rumored to have resorted to cannibalism, but even that horror came from desperation, not evil. The rich, of course, fared better. Nobles could hoard food, store salted meats, and trade for what they needed, but even they could suffer if roads were impassable or crops failed across the region. No one was completely immune. And through it all, you were expected to keep working, to go to the fields, tend the animals, serve your Lord, pray to God, all while your body consumed itself from the inside out. Sometimes, you didn't even die from hunger directly. Your immune system collapsed. You caught a cold that turned into pneumonia, a wound that wouldn't heal, an infection that spread through your starving blood. The famine didn't come all at once, it crept in. One meal less, one meal skipped, one night with just broth, and then another, and another, until finally you didn't notice the hunger anymore, because you were gone. As night falls once again, you retreat to your sleeping space, if you can call it that, a straw-filled mattress in a dark corner, shared with siblings, or perhaps a spouse and children, or even the livestock if you're particularly poor. There's no privacy, no softness, no sense of comfort, just the heavy scent of smoke, damp wall, sweat, and the musty earth beneath your floorboards, or, in some cases, the floor itself. In the modern world, night brings silence, maybe a soft hum from the refrigerator, the low whir of distant traffic. But in the medieval night, silence doesn't come. The sounds shift, but they do not stop. You hear the creak of the wind pressing against your timbered walls, the scratching of rats somewhere in the thatch above, a coughing fit from the far corner of the room, not surprising, since everyone in your house likely has a persistent cough. There's the low, rhythmic groaning of the cows in the adjacent room, and outside, the howling of a dog, or a wolf. You try to settle beneath a woolen blanket. It's coarse and thin. The straw underneath you pokes and shifts, harboring fleas and lice that never truly let you rest. You itch and scratch, swatting at invisible things that crawl beneath your shirt. You can't stretch out, there's no space, and even if there were, you'd curl up instinctively to preserve warmth. The fire in the hearth is nearly out, and the cold is creeping in through the cracks in the wood and stone. There's no brushing your teeth, no changing into pajamas, no shower to wash off the day. You fall asleep dirty, your hands caked with soil, your feet stained from manure, your hair tangled and greasy. There's a smell to everything. You, the room, the bedding, the smoke, the chamber pot in the corner. It's all a part of life, unpleasant, but unnoticed. No one smells good. Clean is relative, and even though you're exhausted, sleep doesn't come easily. You think about the aches in your back from bending over the fields, the rawness of your hands from hauling water, the sting of an open blister on your heel, and the hunger. Always the hunger. There's also the worry. Will your child survive the fever? Will the Lord demand more taxes this season? Will the rains ruin the barley again? You pray, because what else can you do? The church says suffering is holy, that your pain brings you closer to God, that paradise awaits. But paradise feels far away, and you're cold, tired, filthy. Eventually, you drift off, not into a peaceful, dream-filled slumber, but into something heavier, a numb kind of rest, the body shutting down to survive another day. You sleep aside your fears, you sleep among vermin, you sleep with your aching limbs, your growling stomach, your sore muscles. You sleep knowing that tomorrow will be just as hard, or harder. In the medieval world there is no good night's sleep, only sleep that comes when your body has nothing left to give. You wouldn't last a day, and even if you did, you wouldn't rest easy, not in this life, not in this world.